Cathaoirleach, not unlike yourself, I've been in this House for a good many years, and I never thought I'd have an experience like this where I'm participating in a debate on legislation which is supported from all sides of the House, but which nobody hopes will be implemented. Of course, as part of a bigger picture, I don't know how much it's going to cost. I've got no definitive figure from the government as yet as to how much it's going to cost to prevent or to mitigate the Brexit infection from spreading across the Irish Sea. No doubt it's going to cost a considerable amount, and it's money that would be much better spent on health and housing. Despite the fact that the recent events in Westminster have brought about a situation whereby the possibility or the probability of a hard Brexit has receded somewhat, there is still no doubt that it's a possibility, and everybody has spoken about the incalculable damage it's likely to do to the economy both of the UK and Ireland. And yet, despite that, and despite everybody's realisation of this fact, particularly in the United Kingdom, the destructive insanity, the political self-flagellation continues unabated in Westminster. A rump of the Conservative Party, insulated by their wealth from the concerns of the rest of the world, continue with this crusade for nationalistic British purification. Of course, everybody in all sides of the House agree that this legislation is necessary. We have to pass it, we have to be prepared, including, I know, those who, if they had their way, would have us out in the streets canvassing in an election this week rather than being in here debating this legislation. Now, the government says it has been 2 years preparing for the eventuality of Brexit. There are a number of unanswered questions. I mean, the government have been asked on several occasions, what provisions do they have in place in the event of a no-deal Brexit to deal with the border? That's a very clear, unambiguous question, to which we've got no clear, unambiguous answer. The government's contingency plans, and I've read them, are, well, shall we say, vague, to put it at its mildest. We need clarity. As we approach Brexit, as we approach B-Day, we need clarity on these matters, and we need it as a matter of urgency, in view of the fact that we are supporting the government because of this threat to the national economy. And the other thing I want to ask the government is, if they have been preparing for the past 2 years, why are we the last, or one of the last, if not the last country in Europe, in the EU, to introduce this type of legislation? And why has it only been introduced at the last possible moment? There's only about 10 sitting days. It is true, Minister, and if you look at the speeches, including some of the speeches of your own members earlier on, which I followed closely, they've outlined what's happening in the rest of Europe and the other countries, particularly countries who might be affected, but not as much as us, who have passed the legislation much sooner than we did, to give themselves time to reflect and debate it properly. Now, there's only about 10 sitting days left to Brexit, left to the 29th of March, as I understand it, and we're confronted with a Frankenstein-type piece of legislation, drawn up, cobbled together by a large departmental team, covering everything from healthcare to child benefit, from education grants to insolvent companies, from electricity to cross-border bus routes, and it has to be rushed through. I mean, no time for public hearings, no time for detailed consultation with the various interests involved once the bill has been published. We have to have this through by the 29th of March. It's an imperative. Now, on the social welfare side, there are two parts of the bill dealing with social welfare. The first deals with reciprocity of arrangements for the receipt of pensions and other social welfare benefits between the two countries. And that's important, because there are 132,000 people in Ireland at the moment who are receiving a state pension from the United Kingdom. 28,000 is the figure the other way, the vice versa figure. Most of those 28,000, incidentally, are in Northern Ireland. Now, the government proposed to deal with this situation by amending the regulations under the various bits of legislation to take into account the fact that the EU, or that the UK might be a third country after the 29th of March. I have various questions about those regulations, but I don't have to ask them now, as I understand it, because they're going to be subsumed by a convention which has been signed between the Minister for Social Protection and her counterpart in the UK, but which hasn't yet been ratified by the UK. So I assume why we're passing this legislation is that in the unlikely event that that convention doesn't get ratified by the UK by the 29th of March, this legislation will kick in as a temporary provision. I welcome the fact that this convention has been signed, because it does provide legal underpinning to the common travel area arrangements, which have been around since 1924 and whose legal foundation has been questioned. It is decidedly shaky, and this certainly puts legal underpinning. But I would say to the Minister, and I would say to the Government, that, you know, my understanding is that the payment of state pensions on each side of the RSC will continue, and other social welfare benefits will continue as before. But what about private pensions? What about people in this country who are in receipt of private pensions from UK institutions? And there are quite a number of those. And my understanding is that there are some who insist that in order to continue to get these pensions, those people will be forced to open a sterling bank account. And I'm sure they'd be very grateful for reassurance on that point from the Government, that they don't have to do that. It may require some sort of banking arrangement between Ireland and the UK, as I understand it, but I would like to know the position on that. It also would appear that the common travel area rights do not, at present, extend to the spouses or other family members of Irish people living in the UK. An official notice published in by the UK's Brexit Department last Friday stated, and I quote, "The arrangements for existing close family members who are not Irish citizens or British citizens to remain in the UK with or join EU citizens resident in the UK in future are not provided for by the CTA arrangements, but rather under the draft withdrawal agreement." That means, unquote, that means that family members of Irish citizens who want to stay in the UK after Brexit or move there in future will be required to apply for status under the UK's controversial EU settlement scheme. Now, what puzzles me is that why were these people not provided for when the Government were negotiating that convention? Not only are they not provided for, but as I read the convention, particularly Article 4C, they seem to be specifically excluded from it, because Article 4C states that the convention shall not apply to obligations under the UK-EU withdrawal arrangement. So under that withdrawal arrangement, those people will still be obliged to apply for the EU settlement scheme. And I would need clarification on that. In relation to the other part dealing with social protection, namely the protection of people who are employees in this country of a United Kingdom company that becomes insolvent, the legislation appears on the face of it to be fairly comprehensive. It recognises the definition of UK insolvency here. It provides for situations where the insolvent employer doesn't make their PRSA contributions or their occupational pension contributions. It also provides for sharing of information. But I hope, I mean, we haven't had time to examine this fully, but I do hope that it is comprehensive, because if it isn't, then you're going to have, you know, a possibility of a grave injustice arising at some time in the future, where an employee here in this country of a UK-based company may be deprived of rights which he or she would have had they been working for an Irish company, and there's no justification for that. So, in conclusion, Cathaoirleach, we won't be opposing this legislation. Obviously, we recognise the necessity for it, but we hope, and I personally hope, that we'll never see the day that it will have to be implemented.